Good evening. My name is Jordan Orange. I'm the chair of pediatrics at Columbia University and the physician-in-chief at the Morgan Stanley Children's Hospital of New York Presbyterian. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you tonight, and I can't thank you enough for taking some of your valuable time to be with us. Tonight we're embarking in a dialogue over the next hour on rare diseases. I have the privilege of being joined by two of my colleagues in the Department of Pediatrics, both professors at Columbia, and I'll introduce them formally in a moment. Just in the way of some guidelines, we will be recording our session, distributing the link, and posting this on our YouTube channel in case there's something you missed and would like to recap. Most importantly, we welcome your questions and we want to be engaged in a meaningful dialogue, and we encourage you to use the Q&A function in this Zoom webinar to bring forward questions that you might have. We'll reserve time towards the end to open for questions, but we'll redirect in the midst for questions that you may have. We are delighted to engage in this discussion, and it's something that's really meaningful to us. So what are we talking about? And I'll also preface, in case you joined to see the session moderated by Dr. Max Gomez, unfortunately, Dr. Max was unable to be with us tonight. So I will step in his absence and do my best to moderate this session. We exist here as a children's hospital in New York City with a few hundred beds. We exist to take care of children, no matter what they may have. But let's reflect on the fact that most children are healthy most of the time. So what is it that brings children into our hospital? Many things, of course. But when a child gets particularly ill, or when a child is navigating a variety of complexities, that oftentimes falls in the realm of something unusual. And in particular, when we think about rare conditions, rare diseases. A rare disease is defined as something that affects fewer than 200,000 people in the United States. And the definition was created by Congress as it relates to the Orphan Drug Act in 1983 to really encourage our broader community to do something to develop approaches and treatments for those with rare conditions. But the definition goes much broader still, and we'll turn to one of our experts in a moment for some additional perspective. However, when you think about these individual conditions, many of them are quite rare, and some of them involve only just a few people known to have them. But when you start aggregating these conditions, they all of a sudden become maybe not so rare. And when we approach the topic overall, in fact, it can be common. And certainly, were you to experience our hospital and the children in our hospital, many of them have rare conditions. And as a result, it almost feels as if rare conditions are common. And I'm so privileged to be amongst extraordinary expertise here at Columbia and at our children's hospital for rare conditions. Just a quick bit about me. So again, my name is Jordan Orange. I do serve as chair of this department, but I am a physician with expertise in immune conditions, and I have focused on particularly rare conditions of the immune system in trying to understand what it is that children may have, how it is to bring them to a diagnosis, and what we can do to try and improve their lives. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Dr. Wendy Chung. Dr. Wendy Chung is a professor at Columbia, in fact, the Kennedy Professor at Columbia. She is our director of clinical genetics. And boy, all you have to do is look at her Wikipedia page and you'll really just be in awe, as am I. But so many accomplishments. She's a member, elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, has discovered dozens of explanations for rare diseases, and maintains active clinical and research programs. And thank you, Dr. Chung, for joining us. I'm also joined by Dr. Josh Milner. Dr. Milner is a professor of pediatrics at Columbia and is the director of the Division of Allergy, Immunology, and Rheumatology. He too has discovered many diseases. He is newer to Columbia, and prior to that was a lab head and director at the National Institutes of Health at the NIAID, and has brought to Columbia profound expertise and has made some really important discoveries even in the relatively short time that he's been here. That said, let me start and turn to you, Wendy. If you could, I think in some ways, rare disease, it we don't find it, it finds us. And maybe if you could tell us a bit about how you got your start in rare disease, and also to go a little bit deeper on the definition of rare disease, that would be really, really great.
So thanks, Jordan, for having me here tonight. As you were saying, and I just want to emphasize this point, while they're individually rare, they're collectively common. And so in particular for doctors of children, they're quite common to us. And I'll emphasize for any of you who may be watching, even what we think of as common conditions may be rare diseases hiding in disguise. And so what I mean by that is I spend a lot of time studying things like autism, and it could be autism, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, congenital anomalies like congenital heart disease, or what Dr. Milner studies in terms of allergic reactions, or other things Dr. Jordan studies in terms of infections. A lot of these are, I call them zebras, sort of hiding amongst horses. So in other words, we say in medicine, when you hear hoofbeats, you should think of horses. They're much more common than zebras. But for us, I consider us zebra hunters, or individuals who see the zebras amongst the horses. In terms of how I got my start, originally, very long story short, I was a biochemistry major as an undergraduate and had the privilege of being able to work for a short while at the same place that Dr. Milner came from, the NIH, and had the ability to work with some of the real, I think of them as giants in phenylketonuria, or one of the what we call inborn errors of metabolism, one of these rare disorders. But one of the really important ones where we realized that early diagnosis and early treatment could completely change the outcome for those babies. They could go from being intellectually disabled to being able to help them thrive and live pretty normal lives. Some diets they had to adhere to as youngsters, but otherwise pretty normal lives. And that really inspired me to be able to see them in the hospital there at NIH, and then also to be able to study samples from them in the laboratory to ultimately be a physician scientist for some of these rare disorders where we thought we could make an impact in particular with early diagnosis and early treatment. And so I've been doing that ever since. And like I said, I had the luck of being able to start the year, people can figure out my age from this, but the year I started my MD PhD program was the year the Human Genome Project started. And I realized at that time that we would have some amazing tools, but it would take us a while. And for those of you who don't know, it takes a long time to finish all of your MD PhD research and clinical training. And so the 20 years it would take the Human Genome Project to finish, I figured would be about the time it would take me to finish my training. And so with that and with those tools available, while we both finished ahead of schedule, has given me the love affair of being able to understand what those 20,000 genes do. And so that's what I get to do.
Wendy, you put those tools to great work. And want to jump into that in just a moment. And Josh, could you tell us a little bit about how you got your start in rare disease? And again, you have also a little bit of a different take on rare disease.
Yeah, so well, the start for the most part was that basically I knew I wanted to be a doctor, but frankly, I was overwhelmed by too many things to have to pay attention to, and so I thought it would just be best if I tried to just focus on a more narrow slice of medicine, truly. And it's taken a long time for me to be more comfortable broadening the scope of who I follow and the ideas that I get into. But I pretty much walked in knowing that I wanted to study something rare and didn't know what. And then indeed I got my start at the NIH when I was in high school, and got exposed right off the bat to people who all day, every day study rare diseases. But I got put into an immunology lab, and the first week, it just seemed to me that that was the only science that could exist is immunology, and so it stuck. And again, I have learned that there are other things to pursue besides immunology, but it just felt natural. And so combining the science of the immunology with the mystery of how that ends up looking in a patient just really stuck and has felt the most comfortable and natural, despite often being very frustrating when we can't figure out what that connection is. As I've gone along and gotten an appreciation for these disorders, I really do, Wendy puts it as zebras amongst horses. I wonder if also there's a school of thought out there that there are just a lot of zebras, and they just start to look common, and they start to look that everybody starts to look like something similar, but they do have something maybe driving it that's a little bit different in each person. And so certainly one of the things I'm quite interested in is a rare cause for a common disease, right? And that's really driven a lot of what I've looked for. But the process for doing so for me, again, because I'll get overwhelmed with too many people, is to go one by one with someone who has a pretty common presentation, but just something that looks a little bit different enough that makes you want to look what underlies. And so that's kind of how I tend to look at it and operate.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I think it really reiterates, and something certainly I've learned from the study of rare conditions, that everybody really is their own individual, and to really be approaching everyone as their own individual. And that kind of also gets to this concept that hopefully we'll talk about a little bit, which is this term precision medicine. But Wendy, tell us a little bit, because again, you maintain a very robust and sort of internationally reaching program. How do patients get diagnosed with a rare disease?
So you can see behind me that I'm a geneticist, and when we think about rare diseases, the majority of them are actually genetically determined. Not all of them, so I want to admit that, but especially in children, the majority are genetically determined. We used to have a really hard time figuring this out in some cases because when I first went to medical school, people would say, well, it's genetic if you have a family history of something. But for many of these rare diseases, there is no family history for a variety of reasons, but that doesn't mean it's not genetic. That's an important point. Over time, we have been able to, as I said, sequence the genome. We know about those about 20,000 genes. And more importantly, we've been able to cost effectively start to sequence and analyze the genome. And I would posit now it is routine. And if it isn't, you should argue with your doctor, but it should be routine in terms of being able to get access to genomic testing, whether it's genome sequencing, a shortcut that we call exome sequencing. But for most children with significant significant problems that are not proven to be non-genetic, something like an infectious disease or something else, this should actually be a first-line test, in my opinion, being able to get to the answer, get to it quickly in the time frame that's necessary to help that individual most. So short answer, sequence the genome, and by that way, you'll be able to find most of the genetic answers.
Yeah, I mean, that it certainly resonates. And you told us how many genes there are. So how many genetic diseases are there?
It's another good question. So this will just be embarrassing to show how little we know, but it's an honest answer. There are about 18,500 genes, plus or minus. And at this point, we know of about 5,000 of them specifically causing genetic conditions. But that doesn't mean the other 13,500 aren't doing something. It just means we haven't figured it all out yet. So there's still room to go. Lots to learn.
Yeah, and sort of inspiring. It makes one really want to try and do more. But Josh, kind of something that I know you've worked in. Can one gene lead to more than one condition?
Yeah, so right. Not only does it make it difficult that we haven't found what the other 13,000 genes do, but definitely in immunology, we have quite a frequently what ends up happening is that different mutations will cause completely different manifestations of disease. And that's in two ways. One of the ways is that you could have the same mutation, but it manifests differently in different family members. So one family member might have severe atopic dermatitis, another one might have an autoimmune disease, a third one might have a predilection to infection, and they don't cross over necessarily, but yet they have the exact same underlying single gene mutation running in the family. Which actually also makes it a little, it's an opportunity in immunology, but it also makes it harder because they don't always get put together. That autoimmune disease doesn't always get put together with the sibling who gets infections, and they go to different doctors even. So it's not really like, those lanes are crossing in any way, shape, or form. And so that's a major thing that we find in immune conditions that covers huge numbers of different specialties. Where it can affect different ways in different people. The other way is that you can have a mutation in one part of the gene that shuts it off, and then another mutation, another part of the gene that turns it on. And so in the immune system, as you might imagine, very often the mutations that shut genes off make you more likely to get infections. And the mutations that turn genes on usually make you more likely to have inflammatory disease and autoimmunity. And so that complicates things, but it also creates more opportunities to figure out what it is that's going on in someone.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And Wendy, so you've got two immunologists here. Does it work the same kind of genes outside the immune system?
Say that one more time. The same genes outside the immune system?
So does it work the same way outside the
okay.
immune system? With
Yeah.
Multiple genes doing multiple things,
Yeah,
or
so
singular genes doing multiple things?
Yeah, so it happens both directions. I'll give you the one example that I find the most interesting, although there are many. So there's one gene that causes a condition called progeria, very rare condition, about 1 in a million, and it's a premature aging condition. And so sadly, the individuals, largely children, usually die before the age of 20 with just very, very rapid aging. That same gene, as Dr. Milner was saying, different changes within that same gene can also cause a different condition called lipodystrophy, where you literally lose all of the fat. Some of you might think that's a good thing, but it's actually not. But you lose the fat in your body. And that same gene, other different changes can cause a muscular dystrophy or a muscle heart problem, a cardiomyopathy. So again, that same gene, lots of different conditions that originally I never in a million years would have thought that a gene that caused progeria would be a gene that caused a muscular dystrophy. They sort of cognizant dissonance in my head originally. But the genes always actually lead us to the truth, to the right biological answer. So that's true in that case. And then in the other direction, as you were alluding to, Jordan, when we think of autism, a relatively relatively common condition, that might be something like 1 in 58 individuals, we actually know that there are probably over 500 different genetic causes of autism or genetic contributing factors. And so each one of those, and I want to emphasize one thing you said, everyone is unique, and everyone really has to, and I'll say this for any of you that happen to know you have a rare condition, everyone has to represent themselves in research specifically, because as we try and understand these conditions and ultimately come up with treatments for you to be represented and for us to help you, you have to be part of that process. And so everyone really is unique within this, even everyone with Down syndrome, as an example, with trisomy 21, every person with Down syndrome is different. They're each unique, they're each wonderful. And so that's what we need to do, is be able to understand and ultimately get the right type of treatment for the right person.
Yeah, and moving into the kind of treatment component of this is something we all have great hope for. And but just before moving in that direction, Wendy, you mentioned that a fairly common condition, autism, and I know that you've spoken a great deal about autism and some of the underlying potential explanations. But Josh, you mentioned an even more common condition. You mentioned atopic dermatitis. And again, can you tell us a little bit about the frequency of that and how that relates to some of the rare disease genetics we're talking about?
So, right. So depending on the population, you could see atopic dermatitis in half of babies at a certain point in time. But persistent atopic dermatitis is quite common, maybe 1 in 10, and again, in certain populations, 1 in 5. It's really common. And it can get very severe and become highly disruptive. Severe atopic dermatitis, the impact of severe atopic dermatitis on the quality of life is about similarly impacting as type 1 diabetes. And so it really does, it really can become something more than just some dry skin that itches. And there are, again, a number of immune disorders that we study where atopic dermatitis is one of the symptoms. And one of the hard things we sometimes have convincing our colleagues who study other parts of the immune system or even other genetic issues is that just because there's a rare genetic cause doesn't mean that the atopic dermatitis is any different in that person than in anyone else. And so it can present like typical atopic dermatitis, even if there are other symptoms that are going on that are much more peculiar or rare. But a really interesting line of work that is beginning to emerge quite a lot is that rare mutations in pathways, meaning that one gene interacts with another and interacts with another in different ways, in pathways which are fairly well defined, could make up, there are some estimates of over 10% of the common cases of atopic dermatitis. And if someone told me that my child had a 1 in 10 chance of knowing the genetic reason for why they've got it, I would want that every time. I'd want to do that test every time. And so that's just one example. There are other examples, again, in immunology, certain types of things like Evans syndrome, which is a cytopenias and fever that happens in kids that you would think is just an autoimmune problem or an inflammatory problem that can just come out of nowhere in a child of almost any age. Turns out, 1/2 to 2/3 of those patients have a known genetic cause for why that's happening, a single gene cause. And so even though that's a bit less encountered than atopic dermatitis, it just provides an example of the degree to which these rare mutations, and these are not one single cause, there are many, many different causes, just like Wendy was just saying, that can lead to these varied diseases. And I think one of the key points is that 10 or 15 years ago, nobody would have been thinking that way. That's just not the way people were thinking about most autoimmune problems, most allergic problems. It was something with immune deficiencies that started way back. And I think, Jordan, you could speak to it better, that probably is one of the sources of genetic, one of the early genetic diseases that really could be recognized early on in history, and genes found for it early on in history, and also was one of the very first targets for gene therapy, getting to the question about interventions.
Yeah, and that's kind of a really fine transition. I think it's clear that tools are emerging and that we can get answers in ways that we haven't. But let's go ahead and crack that egg at this point to get into precision medicine. And what is precision medicine? And I just want to pause for a second. I see some questions are coming in. We're going to jump into those, and please keep the questions coming into the Q&A. But first, again, let me crack the egg of what is precision medicine, and Wendy, can you share some thoughts with us?
Sure. So the idea, and I'll just give this with one example. So, there could be a condition that you have. I'll just take a case that I've studied for a while, obesity, or people who have problems with their weight. And you could follow the general sort of guidance of diet and exercise. And, for most people, that's in fact true. But I will say that with discoveries that we made about 30 years ago, we do know that there are rare genetic causes of obesity that have helped us understand sort of what Dr. Milner was talking about, the circuits or the pathway involved in why you feel hungry and when you know that you're full. And being able to understand that, there's a company that's made a compound that tricks that system to thinking you're full, something called a melanocortin-4 receptor agonist. And we've done studies, we've been part of them at Columbia, with testing that for very specifically genetically defined forms of obesity. They're in that exact circuit, in that exact pathway. And in fact, what do you know? It works really well for those individuals. You give it to them and literally you can see they don't feel hungry anymore and the pounds just melt off. And so that medication is now FDA approved for those specific genetic forms of obesity. And we're now in the process of testing them for more and more genetic forms of obesity to understand how well they work for others, as well as someday, and I don't know if this is going to work, so I don't want to make any promises. You shouldn't, forget your diet and forget the exercise. But it may be that this may have more general application. So again, as we think about diabetes and insulin being able to treat diabetes, will there be something else we can do in terms of a satiety factor as well for certain forms of obesity? So, but the point is that as we get to this, there may be some specificity. It may not be that it works for everyone. There may be specificity that works for certain individuals with certain types of genetically defined obesity. Then in the same way, as we're starting to get to things like cardiomyopathy, we're coming up with treatments that are specific based on the cardiomyopathy. We need to know what to treat, who to treat, when to treat, with what to treat, also that we don't overtreat or undertreat or have to go by and have some of the casualties of treating with the wrong medication as people are getting sicker during that time. So it's trying to be smart about this and trying to tailor and individualize it to the person.
Yeah, and thanks, Wendy. That's a great example. And so just to reflect, getting a specific genetic diagnosis can help connect to a treatment that may be relevant to that particular patient. But I guess the converse is it may not be relevant to people that do not have that genetic diagnosis. And to carry forward the concept of precision. So I guess if I may, is precision attaching a particular treatment that may work for a particular patient because of what's known about that patient. Does that come close?
I think that's right. I'm going to be even more precise, but it's not just precision, it's also accuracy. So for those of you that are really scientifically inclined, right, we don't just want to be precise in terms of doing this, but we want the right medication or the right treatment. And I think we're getting there, but you're absolutely right. Let me emphasize, it starts with getting the diagnosis right. So we've got to start with that fundamental.
And Josh, you've done some really inspiring work about, attaching treatments to things that you've learned about the biology given the variants that particular people may have in a given gene. So, is there some experience that you can share with the group about that?
Yeah, sure. So there, I had mentioned that when some of the mutations that turn a gene on, as you might imagine, if there is a particular pathway or circuit that's turned on too much, there might be an inhibitor in that pathway that actually could prevent it from being as revved up as it is. And so we've worked on a number of disorders of JAK and STAT signaling. And that's just one of the ways that the signal can go from the outside of a cell inside the cell and turns on a program in the nucleus and starts making proteins and telling the cell what to do, including to create inappropriate inflammation. And so by finding those diagnoses, we are actually able to give FDA-approved JAK inhibitors, which actually just cut that circuit, not too much, but enough so that that excess activity is controlled. And the end result is rather incredible. So there are some folks who will have multiple inflammatory problems, autoimmune problems, swollen lymph nodes, all that sort of a thing. And again, if they get the right diagnosis, that can be treated. But perhaps even more excitingly, there have now been a few cases where a patient was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, let's say, and they happen to get a genetic diagnosis within that honeymoon period when there's still some functioning pancreas. They went on an inhibitor of this pathway, and they're no longer on insulin. So there are multiple cases like this. They're only rare because people don't look enough and because the timing doesn't work just right. Of course, it's an open question. If the first symptom of your rare disease was a common symptom like type 1 diabetes, then you might not know, but that could well end up being something that's treatable. We have another, on the very rare side, a boy who just got urticaria his whole life, allergies to everything, was failing to thrive. He was not even a year old, and he had a gain of a different stat 5. And we put him on the JAK inhibitor, and the parents said, you know, when we don't give it to him one day, he starts getting allergic to the foods he was allergic to before. And I said, you're giving him the peanuts he was allergic to just because he's on the medicine? They said, yeah, but we thought that would be fine. So we would never tell someone to do that. But the bottom line was his typical food allergy went away because we got precise about where his lesion is. But a cautionary tale I just want to briefly say about what Wendy was bringing up about when you're imprecise and inaccurate. And that is that a colleague who's an absolutely brilliant doc saw a particular set of symptoms in a patient and quite reasonably assumed that it was a problem in a pathway that is a gain of function. And he gave an inhibitor of that pathway. Well, it just turned out that that patient had a loss of function of that pathway, leading to a set of symptoms that overlapped a little bit. But when the patient went on the inhibitor, he massively decompensated, and he had to be taken off of that. So you can certainly see how that intervention does need to be quite accurate to work.
Yeah, and that's really meaningful, that we have to get not only the diagnoses right, we have to get the biology right, so that, quite frankly, we can get the interventions right. You know, the goal and objective of this is not in making discoveries or publishing papers. The goal in all of this is really trying to kind of meaningfully improve lives. And you know, that's inspiring. I think that's what gets us up each morning. But there's a number of questions coming in. Some of these, there's kind of one theme that I certainly want to jump into, which is that you know, it's kind of clear from some of the discussion that there's some extraordinary technologies available. You know, we kind of haven't jumped into the specifics of some of that. Maybe this question will get us there. There's some extraordinary technologies available. There are answers that can be available through these technologies, and in some cases, even treatments that can be brought to bear based on the insights that are gained. And you know, two members of our audience tonight have asked the question about you know, particularly how this is kind of working its way through insurance, and what insurance, patients' insurance, you know, is covering, not covering, how to access that, both in terms of, you know, let's kind of start with diagnosis, the levels of diagnosis. There's different ways to approach diagnosis, different types of testing that can be provided, and then, you know, the separate topic of, you know, kind of how one then gets to the, you know, the treatments on the other side of it. But maybe, and again, because a couple of questions touch on this, you know, let's kind of start with the diagnosis aspect and kind of how, you know, where the sort of insurance and coverage community is on behalf of our patients. how we engage with them, what is accessible, and then we can kind of move to the treatment side of it. But Wendy, you want to jump into that?
Sure. So on the diagnosis side, I would argue challenge us. Although it may take pre-authorizations, it may take appeals, it may take things for us to do with working with insurance companies, I would argue that the majority of insurance companies with people who know how to navigate the system can get the right type of genetic testing authorized for patients who need it, for whom it's appropriate. So that doesn't mean every single baby who's born necessarily needs this technology, but we have a pretty good sense of who's going to benefit from this. So challenge us. If you think you need your child or your family member or friend or next door neighbor needs this, contact us afterwards. We're glad to be able to make this a reality. I do know that in certain parts of the world, not surprisingly, this is not nearly as accessible. And so I have colleagues around the world, and it is a country by country issue. And I'll just say we are fortunate in the United States to largely have access to this. There are some cutting edge technologies that are really done on a research basis. And so those are some, for those of you who are aficionados, some long read sequencing, some RNA sequencing, some epigenetics, some things that are really fancy that we still are working on a research basis to solve some difficult to solve cases using traditional clinical methods. But that's why people come to Columbia, as well as we know how to solve the unsolved and to be able to understand those families as well.
And Wendy, you mentioned a few different types of tests. Is there kind of a tiering of tests, and is there a sequence that one can reasonably expect to go through with, a sort of a generic insurer in the United States right now?
Yep. So I will say that every clinical situation is a little different. And so I do think, based on what we know about those underlying conditions, there are some conditions, if you were to come to me with symptoms of cystic fibrosis and it clearly were cystic fibrosis, I don't need to sequence your genome to do that. I need to look at the one gene for cystic fibrosis. So there are certain cases in which an astute, and not even so astute, but a good clinician knows what test to do, and it's a very targeted, inexpensive test to do. In other cases, there can be either little that's known about the condition genetically or a lot of different possibilities. We use the term differential diagnosis, but where it might be one of dozens or hundreds of things. And again, I think delays to diagnosis or that diagnostic odyssey are so incredibly frustrating. It's just a waste of time and effort to do test after test after test. And I have taken care of personally families that have gone through over a dozen tests until arriving at the diagnosis. I will say one plug that I think is important is that in years gone by, we would do invasive types of tests, biopsies, liver biopsies, kidney biopsies, bone marrow biopsies, things like that. And in some cases, not all, but in some cases, you can actually do a simple cheek swab or saliva, much less invasively, and be able to get the same information. And so I would urge you, in terms of something that's safe for a child, let's try doing some non-invasive things before putting kids under procedures.
Yeah, and so that's really helpful. And again, I think the answer is it's going to be slightly different depending upon what someone's individual presentation is. And again, just to follow, some of these things, suggest a treatment. Sometimes this is an FDA approved treatment for that particular condition. I think it would behoove us to recount, say, for example, Spinraza as an example of something. And sometimes it's not an FDA approved treatment. And can you comment on the process once it gets to an actionable genetic explanation?
Yep. So since you mentioned it, Jordan, I'll just say that one of, I think, the tremendous success stories has been for this condition some of you may have heard about, called spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA. I'll just give you a sense, because I'm proud to say we started this here in New York, that every baby born in New York, and increasingly every baby born across the country, is being tested as a newborn for SMA. And you don't have to worry about insurance pre-authorization. That comes as part of your baby's first test. That heel stick for what was originally phenylketonuria that I mentioned before has now been expanded and includes SMA. That condition is incredibly important to diagnose early as possible because it's a degenerative condition, then that's why we at the Babies Hospital here did the pilot study that ultimately led to adoption of SMA newborn screening. And the reason we did that is because the treatment at the time, the first of the treatments, something that was called an oligonucleotide, that was eventually approved for treatment for SMA, and then subsequently gene therapy, both of them we needed to start ideally within the first couple weeks of a baby's life. So we needed to get in early. And now I'm very proud to say that it's not cheap. And I think that's part of what Jordan was alluding to. But we now have Zolgensma, we now have Spinraza, and we also have a pill for certain patients with a different type of SMA. 3 FDA approved treatments now to treat that, what used to be the most common genetic cause of death for children less than 2 years of age. We have completely changed now the possibility for those children to be able to be diagnosed early, and for some of them, fingers crossed, a one and done treatment by simply get a peripheral infusion of that gene therapy. I don't pretend that everything is going to be that easy. I don't pretend that this treatment is cheap. But again, I think especially at our center, we've worked very hard to make sure that every baby that has that diagnosis can be treated and can be treated early in the time frame they need.
Yeah, wonderful insight. And again, I think you mentioned some FDA approved treatments, and again, I think there's a process for navigating those with the payer community. And some of these things are in the process of being studied, or it's going to take a long time to collect enough patients to be studied. And but through research like yours, Josh, that there are demonstrated treatments that can be very effective. What's the experience there?
So yeah, it's it is quite difficult, right? Because you have a rare disease and you have to demonstrate that a drug works or could work before the FDA is going to approve something. Although the notion of a disease being an orphan disease, a rare disease where there's no treatment for it, there are easier ways to get those types of treatments accelerated and studied and then approved. But so as an example, we do need to do a trial that we're working on right now for these JAK inhibitors to be approved by the FDA for treating the genetic problem, not the symptom that the patient has, right? And so that's as an example of where we have to really go through that. And actually, there's a parallel that I thought about. So you were asking about the process of going through checking, trying to test for a single gene, looking at a panel of genes, doing whole genome sequencing, and that there is another step there that Dr. Chung is an expert on, and that we all try to do, is that sometimes you have to move that from the clinical ascertainment, because you can't find the cause, into the research ascertainment, which is very, very different. And I think a lot of times I've found that the patients don't quite understand that there's a difference between the two. You're a doctor, you go figure it out. But in the end, some of that is, you can only get so far from what we already know. There are only those 5,000 genes that we've, genetic causes that we have. There are probably more. And so there's an entire research realm of discovering these the new disorders that is even more specialized than just the typical genetic testing. And that doesn't involve insurance. That involves an investigator who's committed to finding new genes, like so many of our colleagues here and around the world. And so that's the same process then, for these drugs, is that there might happen to be a drug right off the shelf from the FDA, but then you may have to go through a research process to get something approved. We're still not fully approved for giving patients gene therapy for immune disorders, even though we can cure immune disorders with gene therapy. You don't always have to do that, but there are gene disorders that can be cured that way. But there is FDA approval, for instance, for patients who have something called DeGeorge syndrome, which Dr. Chung follows a lot. A fraction of those patients are born without a thymus and therefore with a severe immune deficiency. And after years and years of this very rare manifestation of a rare disease, it was approved to be able to transplant a thymus from a donor into the muscle of one of these patients with the rare disease, and it repopulates their immune system, and they go on their merry way. That's a remarkable example of a rare disease that just through quite a long slog, it's not a simple thing to get to a targeted treatment.
Yeah, no, thanks, Josh. And of course, we're reminded in the chat of many examples of precision diagnosis, precision intervention, the history of genetic conditions, and kind of how some of this has come along. We're reminded of the kind of Nobel Prize winning discovery of Brown and Goldstein and familial hypercholesterolemia. And again, the number of heartwarming examples, is growing. And, it's inspiring to see what is being able to be done based upon actionable information. And some of this also kind of turns to, you mentioned babies, and when you did as well, and newborn screening, that some of this, can be ascertained at the very beginnings of life, and sometimes, even at times post-conception, and to lead to an intervention that can help change course. And again, I'll just mention, of course, severe combined immune deficiency related to DiGeorge syndrome, which is now screened for in every state in the US. And if a hematopoietic stem cell transplant can be performed within the first 3 months of life, there's almost uniform survival and longevity for a disease that otherwise is almost uniformly fatal without treatment within the first year of life. So really just some, kind of profound examples. And for those of you that, may not be familiar, that's the disease that has been associated with the boy in the plastic bubble. And again, now immensely curable from something that's screened at birth. But, Wendy, can you tell us a little bit more about screening and then sort of what some of that holds for us?
So we've been thinking about this a lot. So in the history of newborn screening that started just a little over 50 years ago, again, we were thinking about news you could use is the way I'm going to phrase this. But by early diagnosis, there was effective early intervention. And one of the things that's been frustrating for me is being able to diagnose many of these conditions, but a little too late. So I've had a lot of kiddos that I've met when they were 5, 10, 15, and I've thought to myself, gosh, if I'd only known about that when they were 5 days old instead of 5 years old, or 10 days old instead of 10 years old, we completely could have changed the trajectory. And I've seen that over and over again. So we're really committed at the Children's Hospital to be able to give, I want to emphasize this, every baby a chance at a healthy life to be the best version of themselves in terms of this. And you've heard so many examples already of where we have opportunities, and we need a transformative technology to be able to make those diagnoses early, efficiently, and in a time frame that matters for those children. And so we've been thinking about how to do that on scale. And I think, again, the theme that we've been talking about, rare diseases collectively are common. So how can you do this on scale? And I think the answer to this is going to be a genetically based version of a newborn screen. So not just measuring something like phenylalanine in that heel stick, but being able to make those genetic diagnoses with DNA sequencing. I don't pretend that this is going to be easy. I don't pretend that we're the first to have thought of this, but I do think the time is now in terms of both this matters now because we have treatments now. Increasingly, we have the opportunities with even lots of breakthrough new technologies that are going to be coming, that we have to be able to yoke these together with diagnosis and treatment and be able to move both of these forward simultaneously. So it's a really exciting opportunity. And again, it's a great way to be able to make sure that every baby gets access to this. Every child can grow up healthy.
Yeah, thank you, and inspiring. So we find ourselves in our waning minutes, but there's some really great questions coming in. And so one important one I want to ask is, if you are a patient and you feel that you or your child may have a genetic disease, or if you're a pediatrician and you feel that you have a patient with a genetic disease, where should you go? Who should you go to? Josh?
So Dr. Chung and I may have to take it outside to, to get to the answer. But so the truth is, it is interesting over the last number of years that certain things which always would only be in the purview of medical genetics have sort of creeped into the practices of other specialists who specialize, let's say, in that particular genetic disease, even though they're not a geneticist, they're let's say an allergist immunologist, but it's sort of like everything else in medicine, right? So a hematologist at some point in time was the only person who looked at a CBC, and now I think most of us can look at a CBC, and as Dr. Chung pointed out, that they're astute clinicians, right, who can know what to do. But indeed, it is still emerging so much that it does tend to need to go to folks who pay close attention, either to the set of symptoms, and that person, and that could be a person in a specialty that treats that particular organ system, or to a geneticist who would be the most able to use all the tools to find a gene. But it doesn't tend to happen as much just on every corner. We hope at some point in time to make it easy enough for some of these genetic diseases to be something a primary care doc could just do at some point in time. But in the interim, you do need to find someone who really pays a lot of attention to the particular sets of problems that a person has, and has their foot in genetics, or again, going to a medical geneticist who can to ask that broad question. But Dr. Chung should also answer the same thing.
I think one of the great things about our hospital is that we're a team sport. And so with this, it actually is not uncommon for Josh and I, or Josh and someone else, or me and someone else, to be able to put our heads together for patients. And so when things aren't straightforward, the nice thing that we have at Columbia is the depth on the bench. So in other words, as Josh was saying, there are the routine clinical tests where he sends them or I send them. But when we don't get an answer, we go that extra step in terms of going into our research laboratories and really using some of the emerging tools and methods that we have, as well as, I have to say, the access that many of us have in our laboratories of tens of thousands of other patients that we've studied, and being able to look at them at the aggregate. Because sometimes we don't see patterns from just one child, but we do see patterns when we look at other similar children together, and then we start to recognize those patterns. I will say that, and I think this is probably true for Josh as well, one of the things we've tried to do is make sure things are accessible. We know life is crazy. We know things are difficult. So we offer a lot of video appointments. We found ways for kids that are afraid of having their blood drawn, or to be able to do it from home, to do cheek swabs or saliva kits. We make sure insurance covers this. So there shouldn't be any problem in terms of access. If there is, literally give us directly a call or an email and we'll take care of it. But we want to make sure every child has access to this type of diagnostic testing so they can get on to the treatment. That's the important part.
Yeah, it just couldn't be more meaningful. And I think the last question before concluding is, there's a few that have come in about really what this all means to patients and families. And of course, this is needs to create expertise and learning in something that people had necessarily no interest in. We decided to kind of spend our lives studying these things. People affected by this did not. And now it's something that people have to learn about, live with, navigate, and it's a weight to carry. And one of our audience stated that very clearly. And what are we doing, and what can be done? And one thing that I do want to mention is that at Columbia, we have very active investigation programs on rare diseases and conditions. And we have millions and millions of dollars from the National Institutes of Health to study rare diseases, to try and bring answers to patients, to define new conditions and new paths. And Columbia is a wonderful environment from which to obtain federal funding to promote these investigations. That said, we do, there's many other things that we do, but really, kind of hear that very clearly, and just want to kind of turn to my colleagues in the closing moments is really kind of our thought. And Wendy, you also said the diagnostic journey, the diagnostic odyssey, and you know, having been on that journey and that odyssey with families, it's profound, to years and sometimes generations without answers, and to try to get to answers and to try and get to even interventions. And I will, my own kind of closing thought is that, it's I hear you, and my heart goes out to you, and we really are inspired by you and want to be doing everything that we possibly can to try and help shorten your diagnostic odysseys, to try and partner with you as physicians to be meaningful for patients, and to bring new things to bear. But please let me turn to you, Josh.
I think you put it that you're on a diagnostic odyssey together. I think that as much as I can say it as clearly as I can, when someone comes to me with an unknown immunologic problem, I feel that burden. I'm burdened by the fact that we have to get to the bottom of this, and I get massively frustrated when an answer doesn't come from step 1, step 2, or step 3 of looking into the genetics. And so I'm, driven to try and fight for the resources to be able to solve that problem. It won't always work. It may not always be something that's in my capabilities, and so I have to be honest about that. But my goodness, the degree to which that's also something on us, I can't be understated enough.
Thank you. And Wendy, please.
I just want to say you're not alone. You're not alone because you've got, as Josh was saying, you've got us behind you. We have incredible teams also with us. So other teams of multiple other specialists, social workers, in some cases, genetic counselors, nurse practitioners, clinical trial teams, an army behind you. And you're also not alone because one of the things that's been great about being able to get online, whether it's Facebook or other groups, is we realize that even though it might feel rare and it might feel alone, there are oftentimes many other people around the world that have your same exact family's genetic condition or rare condition. And so there's just been, I want to also put a shout out to the families and the family group leaders who do such an incredible job in terms of being part of this leadership in the community, both in terms of raising awareness, fighting in some cases for funding, sacrificing day and night to be able to make sure that their voices are heard and that they are shaping the research that we're doing. It's that combination, that partnership all around scientists, physicians, healthcare providers, public health officials, families. We're all in this together. And that's what really gives me the energy to keep fighting and keep going up that hill every day.
And again, just what a privilege to be surrounded by colleagues that have this mindset and to be joined together to try and make a difference. And I think, Wendy, your words really encapsulate it all, and there's no better way to conclude this session. And I can't thank all of you enough for spending some of your evening time with us. We certainly welcome your outreach. It again is a work in process, but a meaningful work in process. And I can't thank you enough for joining us this evening. And of course, thanks to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jordan.
Good night.